part of the moat as well. As you build a company and you've gotten something through in healthcare, it is very unlikely that unless it doesn't work or unless there's significant issues with utilizing the product, you would not be displaced very easily, right? Because the switching costs are significant. There are better priorities for clinics to focus on than to change the supplier of a certain product.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Hustling Unicorns with Harshith podcast. This is a podcast where we talk to founders, founding engineers, VCs, angel investors, operators, and all the other folks in the startup ecosystem. And to start the first episode, we have with us Ashwin from Sapyen. Hi, Ashwin.
Hi, Harshith. How are you going?
Good, thank you. So Ashwin and I have been friends for a long time now, and when I thought of starting this podcast, the first person who came to my mind was Ashwin, so we just got him here. So Ashwin, why don't you talk to us about what Sapyen is for all those viewers who do not know what Sapyen does?
Yeah, Sapien's an at-home sperm analysis. So think of it like a 23andMe or Ancestry.com test kit. Effectively allows for men to collect a sample at home and ship it to an IVF clinic or a pathology center for analysis. Fundamental reason that becomes important to do at home is because men have a significant difficulty when it comes to going to the lab from a stigma perspective, but also two, sperm samples only have a viability of 1 hour post collection, which effectively means every single time someone collects a sample, after an hour, the sperm sample is no longer viable for diagnostic analysis. So you need to collect a sample and get it tested within the hour. That poses a significant constraint for most lab chains and IVF clinics around the world. So we solve problems for both the patient from an embarrassment standpoint and convenience standpoint, but also on the flip side, from an IVF clinic and lab perspective, where we make it a lot more efficient for most clinics to come on board and use the product.
Very interesting. I think that's like a both side thing, then a pretty big thing. So we'll just get into dissecting that in just a bit. So Ashwin, can you talk us through the process of what made you leave your job, your previous job, and decide that you want to start your own company? What was that moment, or was it a journey? What was it like for you?
It wasn't as elaborate, I think, as most people want it to be, right? It's not an interesting enough story. The reality is I'd sort of gotten to the point in my career where I'd hit every milestone that I wanted to hit. I checked every box, and I didn't know what else to do with my career that was going to transformationally impact me. I wasn't learning enough, so I took a step back and got started with Sapyen effectively because my uncle went through a male fertility diagnosis in the United States and had a negative outcome. And I thought to myself, it'd be pretty interesting to go into an IVF clinic and get a test myself. But what you recognize in the waiting room of most IVF clinics is women who are making a very conscious decision to go through IVF, and men who are involuntarily there. They don't really know what the process is. They're not very engaged, and they have to do something that isn't necessarily the most convenient. And I can appreciate all the women who are looking at it going, women have had to deal with this shit for a long time. But the parallel that I'd like to draw is pregnancy testing was a nightmare about 20 years ago. Right, women had to go into a gynecology office and get an in-person examination, and now you could go into a store, a Walmart or a Target, and get something for less than $10 off the shelf. And that paradigm shift hadn't occurred in male fertility yet. So when you think about it, male fertility is about 50% of the equation when it comes to fertility, but didn't have a simplistic enough solution. And that was the trigger moment.
Wow. So, thinking about this idea and what you guys are doing, I'm super long on the idea, and I think what you guys are doing is amazing. But what convinced you that this was the right time, number one? And number two, that you can do it at this point in time? What was it that what was that trigger that you thought I can do this right now?
Yeah, it's two different very responses there. What convinced me the time was right? Two things, actually. One, I think the rate of people going through IVF was increasing quite substantially. The number of people that I was chatting to, I know it's a very anecdotal way to get started with something, but I was chatting to people in my network of people, and everybody knew someone else that had been through IVF. And just looking at it statistically, we're destined to have about 50% of the population go through IVF in about 20 years. Right, to be able to have a child. And IVF might be a small subsection of the ART program, but effectively, most people will have assisted reproductive techniques to have a child. And that was a jarring enough statistic on its own. Two, also, when I first thought about the business, I thought to myself, if I could convince maybe 10 people through a Facebook ad or something of that sort to try and click a button and tell me that they're interested in the product, that would be interesting enough and give me enough of a motivation to do something with this. I ran a couple of ads overnight and woke up to around 170 people signed up to a wait list, ran it for the week and had about 5,000 people signed up to a wait list. Now, I can tell you all the reasons why that wasn't massively beneficial over time because those waitlist numbers don't convert. But at the same time, it was interesting enough. People were aware of the problem. People were experiencing problems. A lot of people can't fall pregnant right away without trying for a long enough time, without assisted reproductive techniques or supplements and things of that sort. So it felt correct. And why did I think I could do it? I didn't know any better. Right. And
Wow.
I mean, I think when you operate with a sense of ignorance, when you think about something and you think to yourself, oh, maybe I could give it a try, maybe I could give it a go. And I spent a bit of time talking to scientists and physicians around the world to get a sense for whether or not this would be something that we could accomplish. The biggest barrier was scientific because sperm samples die 1 hour post collection. We invented something in house, which is now patent pending, that enhances the viability of sperm from 1 hour to 3 days. It's a liquid when added to sperm samples, increases the viability to 3 days. And that was the game changer that then led to all these IVF clinics around the world wanting to partner with us. It was a significant uphill battle, but I didn't know any better at the start.
Wow. I mean, I think I completely understand what you're talking about when you think like not knowing any better was a good idea, because I think if everyone was too realistic about, hey, this might not work, let me just sit back and like take that stance, no one's actually going to build anything that will disrupt the world. So I think that's like a fantastic approach to what you were actually thinking about. So
Just going, if you knew how hard it was to go to university and get a master's degree and whatever, you probably wouldn't have done it at some point. If people kept telling you how difficult it was,
yeah.
there's statistics around that tell you why you shouldn't do something. But I think people need to learn to say yes more.
Wow, fantastic. I think that's a really great approach, Ashwin. Thank you so much for that. So, Ashwin, you're talking about how you solve like two sides of the puzzle, right? I understand like how you solve like the in-home problem for patients. How do you solve it on like the fertility clinic side of things? Like, what do you do? Do you like establish SOPs? Do you like set up things for them directly? How do you generally operate?
Yeah, I'll tell you how we got to the problem in the first place, right? I spoke to all the private equity funds that now own IVF clinics. It's sort of the flavor of the decade. Every private equity fund wants an IVF clinic. And when you chat to them, my first question was effectively, do you think it would improve your stance as an IVF clinic or a private equity fund if I improve patient experience? And the answer was no, because patient experience is a cost center, right? If you spend more money on patient experience, it doesn't mean that it will necessarily bring in more money, because there's huge wait lists for patients in the United States, for IVF clinics in the United States. There's no necessary reason for someone to go and invest money into patient experience. But on the flip side, sperm samples being viable for 1 hour meant that every single high density population area needed a sperm analysis lab. And two, the only reason why people picked a certain IVF clinic, only two reasons, was one, because it was close to them, or one, because their friend and family went to a certain doctor that had a positive outcome, right? And that inherently meant geographical constraints were one of the biggest reasons why IVF clinics couldn't grow, and the cost of real estate was so large. So IVF clinics went for two things. If you can, one, eliminate the need for labs in every high density population area, centralize the operations to one location across the United States or wherever else. And two, if you can make it viable for patients to not be constrained to a 5 kilometer radius and increase that radius to a longer distance, those would be two things that would put money into the pocket of an IVF clinic. And I know it's a very transactional approach to this, but I think it's imperative to note that good medicine is good money. And I think at the end of the day, it's imperative that IVF clinics need to make money in order to continue to provide good service to patients. So it's important for them to continue to think about how they're going to make top line improvements or bottom line improvements, or both. And that was the biggest turning point in making the decision towards working with IVF clinics. We now help IVF clinics consolidate their lab chains into one central location. And two, it increases the radius from a 5 kilometer radius to a 3 day radius by post.
Makes sense. Makes sense. That's pretty cool. So, Ashwin, you're talking about the Facebook ad and stuff like that, right? What was that thing like? So, I'm imagining like in a lot of countries, this would still be a certain kind of taboo and like things like that, right? People would not be openly ready to talk about it. But did you face that when you were doing it in the countries you were doing it in, and like what was that experience like?
Yeah, men aren't necessarily very talk about it regardless of which country you're in, right? I think there's certain countries where it's been minimized, the taboo around male fertility or fertility in general. But what we found really interesting was most men didn't even know what male fertility was. The terminology male fertility, that doesn't necessarily translate to sperm health, or doesn't necessarily translate to it's important for me to think about it in order to have a child. Most men don't necessarily grow up assuming that they play a significant part in having the child, with the exception of the part they play in getting someone pregnant. Right, and that was a significant learning point for me. Is people, one, shied away from having the conversation, and two, they didn't understand the terminology. So it took a lot of time, and then we decided instead of spending the time creating the market, the best approach would be to approach large-scale IVF clinics where men collect themselves to conduct a test, and every single man that's going through IVF along with a partner requires a sperm analysis. And that was the best starting point because you're servicing men that have a dire necessity to an improved process. And once you start there, you then move into a more consumer approach whereby you're educating the population to improve their understanding of male fertility. But what's imperative to note is education doesn't necessarily always work, and or it's very expensive because people don't like to be educated.
Interesting. So instead of like directly approaching the consumer and consumers directly, you partner with clinics and like give out your kits through there. Like that, I think that's like a fantastic channel to like start your initial sales at least. But Ashwin, can you talk about how you onboarded these IVF clinics itself? Like, did you get an approval, like an FDA or like some sort of an approval firsthand, and then went and spoke to the clinics? And like, was there resistance from the clinics? Like, hey, we don't want to use it. We have what we have. What was that journey like for you?
Yeah, regs are an excruciating part of building a medical device business, but a necessary part, and I can appreciate why they're in place because a negative outcome in healthcare can actually mean quite significantly negative outcomes for patients. So the requirement for stringent process is very much appreciated in certain instances. And yes, there is a lot of resistance when you're going through IVF clinics and trying to get a new product in. And I would, if from a more industry specific standpoint, there's examples like the embryoscope, the time lapse machines that took a very long time for people to convince an IVF clinic to utilize because end of the day, people are afraid of change. And we went into market and said, well, do you want us to improve patient experience? We spent 6 months pushing that uphill, that messaging uphill, and no one was interested. Australia was particularly a tough market because Australia is not necessarily the first country to bite when innovative products are placed in front of them. And it wasn't until we sold our first contract in the UK, which is a completely different market to where I was based, that the Australian clinics got interested. Right, so I sold our first ever contract in the UK, and then 3 days later had our first major Australian deal with one of the largest IVF clinics there. So yeah, look, I mean, resistance is almost ubiquitous, and it's synonymous
It's
with the
part of the
idea.
process.
It is part of the process, unfortunately, but also it is part of the biggest part of the moat as well. As you build a company and you've gotten something through in healthcare, it is very unlikely that unless it doesn't work or unless there's significant issues with utilizing the product, you would not be displaced very easily, right? Because the switching costs are significant. There are better priorities for clinics to focus on than to change the supplier of a certain product.
Makes sense. So, Ashwin, when I think about the idea of like what you guys are doing, it seems like an obvious solution, like that has to exist. Like, why did it not? Why do you think it did not exist until now? And like, do you have competitors are also there who are like doing 3 4 days things as well? Like, because when I think about it, like this is
Yeah.
a problem that is like obvious, right? Like, it is a problem. Like, how did you? Yeah, how did? What was like? What was that like for you?
Um, it's not as obvious as you think. I mean, in retrospect,
In hindsight, sure, sure.
in retrospect, it makes perfect sense, right? Like, and I was saying to you earlier, most men don't necessarily appreciate what male fertility is as a concept. And the people that do complain about it, the people that will tell you things like, oh, I had such an embarrassing experience at an IVF clinic once collecting a sample in person, you need to also recognize that those are the patients that have already collected a sample and their process is done with, right? The people that complained were people that have already done the process, not people that are thinking about doing the process in the future. That's where we went wrong at the very beginning because we thought to ourselves improving patient experience was as simple as removing embarrassment from the equation. Unfortunately, men don't necessarily, I mean, there's a part of them that feels embarrassed about going into an IVF clinic, but the benefit of having a child far outweighs the tiny momentary embarrassment, right? And a lot of men feel the gravity of that embarrassment or the nuances that they didn't like about the process after they've already collected a sample at an IVF clinic. And at that point, that's not your patient anymore. That's not your customer. Um, so yeah, look, it's not as obvious from that perspective, but also number two, there's also a significant scientific barrier. It's not as simplistic as blood tests, which over the years is a relatively perfected process. And a lot of blood testing companies now exist. You can buy a test kit of like Thermo Fisher, for example, and repackage it and sell it as a whole new product. And there's a number of businesses that do that. And I think sperm analysis, particularly given the scientific barriers, is quite difficult for people to enter into. IVF clinics have tried for a very long time, but it's worth noting that a lot of researchers don't have an incentive to actually invent the solution to a problem. They keep getting financed to do more research, and they get very excited about the prospect of developing more science as opposed to learning when to commercialize something. They become excellent additions to companies like Sapyen as opposed to within the healthcare system where they're currently not necessarily utilized to the best of their capacity.
No, absolutely. I think that makes complete sense. So, Ashwin, I've heard like pretty interesting numbers about your like demand and like growth. So, like, can you talk about like what markets you guys are operating in? And also for those who are not aware, Sapien, I think is based out of Australia, or was it first based out of Australia? Where you guys like?
We started the company in Melbourne, Australia, which is also the birthplace of IVF. Um,
Oh, wow. Okay, that's not a coincidence then.
so it was definitely a coincidence. It wasn't that thought through when we started the company. I was based in Melbourne at the time. It just so happened that Melbourne happens to be one of the hub spots for IVF in the world. Started in Australia, now a US incorporated company for the purpose of capital raising, things like that. So there's a lot of compliance around what we do. Started in Melbourne. Melbourne, we do about 130,000 IVF cycles in Australia, which is far more IVF cycles in Australia than there is in the whole of the UK. The UK is around
Wow,
80,000 a year. So the consumption of IVF at a per capita level was pretty high, but also forget per capita, just talk about a population level. We do more IVF cycles in Australia than so many other countries in the world, right? So Australia was a good place to start the company in. But to be fair with you, in retrospect, I can justify that decision. I just started the company in Australia because I was in Australia,
makes more.
right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Pretty simplistic decision as far as I was concerned. And in terms of numbers, like we work with about 80 to 85% of the Australian IVF clinic market. Virtually most clinics in Australia use the product. Virtually every single clinic in the country does. In the US, we're about 30% of IVF clinics in the US. In the UK, we are say maybe 30 to 40% of clinics in the UK as well. Growing pretty consistently, and the demand for the product has increased quite substantially over the last year or so, because one of the things we're very particular about was not taking the patient away from the clinic. And clinics have a lot of insecurities with regards to that, but from two different specific perspectives. One, they don't want to lose revenue on a patient, which is understandable, but two, also, and the most important aspect is continuity of care. Right. So you have a patient that then goes to a company to do a sperm analysis. And then if you don't get the patient back, you don't really know what's happening to the patient, whether they're receiving the right amount of care, the right quality of care. So it's always important to get the patient back into a system that can care for them beyond what we do, which is provide them a diagnostic service. Right. So think of ourselves as the likes of LabCorp or Quest Diagnostics. You go in there to get a diagnostic assessment, but always need to go back to a doctor to get complete care from that point.
Makes sense. So, Ashwin, have you guys ever thought about building an end-to-end like stack or like like software stack for like doing this whole process? Because I'm assuming every IVF clinic would have its own system, and like, have you guys ever thought about building a unified stack for all of this?
We thought about it and we told ourselves we were wrong about it as well. Like
Okay.
building new technology to solve for problems or software technology for specific issues doesn't necessarily solve real problems for IVF clinics in most instances. And I've always been of the opinion that incremental change doesn't always equate incremental value. Right. So you end up building incremental technologies all the time in software, and it doesn't necessarily benefit anybody incrementally. And end of the day, most IVF clinics are already working with large EMR providers. The best way to go about it really is to integrate with EMR solutions that are already in place, as opposed to try and build your own EMR solution. Because the last thing a doctor wants is to swap between five different EMR solutions, one for each provider, right? Which a lot of healthcare companies go down the rabbit hole of building an EMR solution. But I'd love to ask them, how many of these EMR solutions actually get used by doctors, and I'd be very surprised if doctors are actually using the product.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So, Ashwin, so since it's a medical product and we're talking about regulations, right? So, if someone wants to bring something new to the market and they want to operate in certain geographies, like what are considered like the gold standards of approvals? Like I think FDA is one of them, and what other tests do you usually have to qualify to operate in Europe, Asia, and other parts of the US?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily think of them as gold standard, but rather the required baseline for each market, right? The
Okay.
US got the FDA, you've got the CE mark for Europe, you've got the MHRA or MDR for the UK, you've got the TGA for Australia, and local specific requirements in different markets around the world. And they just become part of the requirement. Oftentimes manufacturing requirements are quite stringent as well. We need to be manufactured in ISO 13485 facility, good manufacturing practice facility, and those become requirements to then access FDA clearance or approval or listing. Uh, the process for types of businesses can vary quite significantly. We're a diagnostic device, we're not a therapeutic. It is very different if you're building a drug, for instance. We do benefit from having a relatively safe product for most consumers to utilize. Right, you're not ingesting the product, and there's no risk from utilizing the product in the comfort of home. So our process was a lot more linear than it is for most other businesses.
Makes sense. So, in general, when we talk to like healthcare companies, right, like or healthcare startups or medical device startup, there are typically capital intensive. Like, so did you ever raise funds, and like, are you guys raising funds? What was like your experience and process along that stuff?
Yeah, we've raised just around $10 million to date from some of the larger funds around the world. Most recently, led by XC, which is backed by HCF, one of Australia's largest health insurance companies. Um, Backed by around 7 funds today. Yeah, look, it's a capital intensive process, but I'd also like to argue that we're less capital intensive than building a software business in many instances. And but in saying that, I will acknowledge that not every medical device business or every therapeutic business in the world is capital like that doesn't require as much capital. It's important to note that it's very individualistic when you're building a company. In our case, we were very quick to get approvals done from the reg bodies that we were working with. It's very quick to try and get market traction, get product market fit across the market we're operating in. And we were a very small team. For the longest time, we had 3 people on the team. We've now expanded out to 9. So very small team, particularly given the size of distribution we've got. And the reason for that for me has always been I think that a small group of people that are empowered to make big decisions and that have the capacity to make big decisions always outperform larger teams that are relatively built around inefficiencies, right? So I've built the company around that, and it's worked pretty okay. But yeah, we are backed by some large funds around the world, like Ice House Ventures and Antler and HCF more recently.
Cool. So, Ashwin, what kind of rounds were these? Was this like a seed round, a Series A? Do you guys have names for it, or is it just like a round? What do you guys generally do?
I just haven't named them because
Fair enough.
we've raised 3 rounds today. The most recent one was around $8.2 million.
Got it.
The bulk of the $10 million was raised more recently as opposed to historically. Yep.
Got it. Makes sense. So, Ashwin, just like any non-software business, you have a physical product that actually exists, right? So, how do you go about like, do you manufacture it yourself? Do you have like other companies that manufacture for you? How do you, do all these things? Like, how do you figure it out? Like, someone's getting in and say they've invented something in a lab today. How do they go about commercializing it? How do they go and find out people who can produce it for them? And what does that generally look like?
Yeah, we use a contract manufacturer. We've got contract manufacturing facilities in Australia and Hong Kong. And we also have third-party logistics companies in Australia, the UK, and the US. So we've got multiple distribution facilities. It is complicated if you really understand what you're doing, but the reality, again, taking it back to what I was saying earlier, I did not know anything about what I was doing. So as and when things happen, we just figured it out. And I know that's a very like I haven't necessarily given you any substance with that response, but the reality of it is you contact a few manufacturers, try and get quotes. They always try and push you down injection molding or some kind of high minimum order quantities, and then you just negotiate, right? It's been relatively straightforward in that operations for me is complicated because there's a lot of moving parts, but at the same time, operations always got a playbook. We're not the first company in the world that's distributing a product, right? We're not the first company in the world that's manufactured something or taking it out to a different country or importing a product. So I think operations is the simplest piece of the puzzle because you can always hire smart people and give them a playbook. The complicated bit was the science and the partnerships, the sales, which in our industry didn't have a playbook. Right. When I was selling to an IVF clinic, virtually no one in my industry has actually previously sold to an IVF clinic at the scale that we have in the past. Right. So we did a lot of things for the first time and no one's ever done it. So that was more challenging, I would say, than getting the product manufactured or distributed.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So, Ashwin, when usually companies or like startups or people come up with ideas, they go to incubators or residency programs. So, like, did you go through any of them? What was your experience like if you did go through any of them?
I did actually. I went through Antler earlier in the process. Antler are I think they go by day zero investor at the moment. We didn't have an idea back then, so I was talking to you about my uncle going through a male fertility experience. I had an understanding of what I wanted to potentially pursue. But what was most valuable for me through the process was it's like I think a 12-week residency process that could have changed quite dramatically since the last time I did it, which was about 2.5 years ago. But helpful one because everybody was on the same page as me. Everybody was working towards getting an outcome. We put things into a timeline, which is very helpful. And you end up trying to prove a lot in a short period of time to get an outcome because otherwise you don't raise any money. But you've got a deadline in place. And that was the most helpful aspect of it. And then I walked out with a little bit of money from Antler, which helped me finance the first purchase of inventory and things like that. So I couldn't pay myself for about a year and a half. I couldn't pay employees. I didn't have employees in the team for about 9 months. So quite a lot of the business was built in isolation, but it gave me enough confidence to go buy inventory and set up a warehousing facility. And for about a year and a half, I packed every single order that came through. So it was quite a strenuous process, but it like Antler was beneficial enough to the point where, it's certain instances where we had difficulties in building the business. It's a good touch point for me to go have a conversation with someone that understood how we built the business from the ground up. And they put money into the business maybe 3 times so far. So
Wow.
good investors all around. I'd say they're my most valuable investor to date.
Wow. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I think they've made good money on you too. So,
Well, no, that's
yeah,
always the hope for everybody, right?
100%, 100%. So, Ashwin, you're talking about going to the Antler program, residencies and stuff like that, right? So, was this before you had like, let's say the IP behind what you were building, or do you come up with the IP after going there? Like you set a timeline, then built an IP. What was that process like for you?
Didn't have IP ahead of time, built IP through the process, and in conjunction with some of the larger scientific networks and research labs across Australia. But yeah, like I had nothing when I went into Antler, just an idea, just actually not even a properly built idea. It's like a concept and an understanding of the market based on maybe 5 interactions with people that I've had. That was it. And I think put under time pressure and then a lot to prove on the line, you just do it or you don't. But you do it in most cases.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah, I think that's what people tell, right? You've got to like get out of your comfort zone and like push yourself, and that's only when you know whether you'll succeed or fail. Just sitting and like thinking about I could potentially this, but do that, like that's generally not gonna just work.
I think the most exciting things start at the end of your comfort zone. Right.
100%.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So, what are some of the hardest things you guys are working on, Ashwin, at this point? Like, I understand like you guys are like already doing pretty good in numbers and you're compounding in growth as well. So, are there any other challenges you think you guys are really working on right now? And like another thing is like, I mean, assuming there will be some incumbents in the industry who are trying to kind of restrict your motion or like, at least give you stiff competition or maybe try to, enter your kind of territory. Like, how do you deal with those kind of situations too?
I'll answer your second question first about competitors and incumbents in the market. We work very well with incumbents in the market, like I was saying to you earlier. I think it's worth noting that a lot of innovation in healthcare only happens or only comes into effect when you're supported by incumbents in the industry. It's very unlikely that you could go into the system and change it and turn it upside down without the support of people from inside of the system. I think it's typically a fallacy when people come into play and say, well, I'm going to do a direct to consumer startup because well people will listen to me as opposed to going to their own doctor. Very unlikely. What we saw during COVID was, actually over the last 3 years or so, we've seen that telehealth has been a massive success, but virtually every single business that built a telehealth platform died because the moment doctors started adopting telehealth at scale, patients started going back to their own doctors for online consultations as opposed to going to a startup that introduced them to a whole different set of doctors. When shit hits the fan, you're still going back to your hospital, right? So as much as people can tell you they don't trust the health system, they inherently do, right? And therefore, working with incumbents becomes very important. As far as startup competitors and stuff, people try and do what we do, but they don't do it as well as we do it. So it's pretty straightforward. I think we were a better price, better science. There's no reason why anyone else has a chance. And I think flip side from the earlier question you asked me about the hardest thing we're working on at the moment, the hardest thing I'm working on is being able to build a team that's going to be efficient and to scale from, I know we're talking small numbers from 3 to 9, but that's still 3xing your team overnight. We hired 6 people within a span of 2 weeks,
Oh,
and we
wow.
recently were out in Spain. We did a couple of day strategy session with everybody. Just to clarify, we were already in Spain for a conference, so we didn't fly everybody out to Spain for a strategy
Fair
day.
enough. It's not like a team outing or like a, I get it. Sure.
This is just in case we have investors listening in. I'm just like, I'm very responsible with the capital we raise. Besides the point, look, I think scaling the team out is going to be pretty important and getting it right because my team's very experienced, right? We hired Sati recently in the UK market. She's done about 25 years or so in the fertility market in the UK. Amy, who was our most recent US sales director, significant experience selling capital equipment for Siemens and Johnson and Johnson, most recently Cooper Surgical, for about 20 years as well. So people with significant amount of experience in the market, they understand how this works inherently. We just need to give them the right resources to get to solving the problem for us, because I think I can't expect the people to change everything for me without providing them the right resources. Right. So the next few months for me is going to be working alongside the team. So I'm in the UK at the moment, training our UK sales team and also bringing in one of my US sales teams to travel with me, whilst I sell product in front of them. So just to train them on how exactly we do things. But I'm spending about 3 weeks in California with my US team to try and help them figure out how exactly we sell product there. So a lot of my work is just traveling and helping people figure out how to do what we do best.
Wow. Yeah, I think the last time we spoke, I think you were, yeah, we were in New York at that point in time, and like every time I've spoken to Ashwin ever since, he's been in a different country. So yeah, it's very interesting, and I would say very stressful too, doing what you're doing.
I was like, look,
I don't know how you do it, Matt.
I feel it in my back, but
I can imagine. I can imagine.
all the travel, like it's very exciting when you first start to do it because it's the idea of growing the company and you see it happen in front of you, and there's nothing more exciting. I still feel that. I still feel like it's the best work I've ever done, and I don't have any resentment towards the time I've spent towards the business, which I very much enjoy. Um,
100%.
Team that I get to build, the fact that people trust me with their careers, I think is a pretty positive sign. But at the same time, traveling and flying to different countries,
Not the easiest thing.
40-hour flight from Australia to the US, it's pretty much a nightmare.
100%. So,
Yeah.
Ashwin, you're talking about hiring very like folks across the board, right? So, how do you go? What do you pitch to them that makes them believe in a startup that just has like three, four people? Like, sure, your market share is good. Is that like the only selling point you guys have, or like is there something else that people are finding really interesting in joining your team? Like, what do you generally think the idea is?
It's a few different things. Look, I mean, I think everybody's had a some type of personal experience with the system, right? With IVF specifically, they've have had an experience of some sort, have worked in the industry and understand it very closely and personally, and that was a very significant motivator. To chat about my second hire, Joel Ho, who leads market development for us in Australia, he spent about 5 months coming to my office on a weekly basis to catch up with me when we didn't have a role in the market, trying to convince me to make a role for him. And
Wow.
he's been in the business since June 2023. Um, he had his child through IVF, and I think he understood something about the market that a lot of people don't particularly understand. And I think it's important to note that when people have experiences in their lives, they tend to understand exactly how to solve for it, and they want to back a business or back a set of people that have a very systematic approach towards solving a problem that they experienced, right? And I think that was a huge starting point for how we attracted talent early on, and then it became a function of the more good people you hire, the better the next quality
The
people.
network effect of, yeah, good people
Right.
around makes sense.
If we hired bad people early on, we'd struggle to hire good people into the future. I think for some reason we've been pretty good at attracting talent, and I've also been very grateful for the fact that good people apply and good people refer other candidates to us. And the moment they come into Sapien, one of the things they learn very quickly is this is an autonomous working process. But I'm involved if you want me to be involved, and the degree to which I'm involved is very much dictated by the people that want me to be involved. I implicitly trust my team to go get the work done, and they've done a good job so far.
No, 100%. So, Ashwin, was this the first idea you came up with, or did you also come up with other ideas you probably market tested and you're like, this is not going to work? What was that like for you?
Look, I've done a lot of things in my life that have failed quite miserably, so so this
I
is
mean,
definitely.
I think that is the truth, right? Because like every time I talk to people, no one's built the first idea successfully. Like that is generally atypical.
I was going to say there's probably someone really smart out there that's got it the first time around, but that's not me, right? I've had to work really hard to get to this point, and it just wasn't simplistic. And there's so many things about, I built a couple of businesses in the past. I ran a college consultancy business when I was a lot younger, getting people into universities in the United States. Did that for a while, made a bit of money doing that, and I was very excited as a little kid that's making a bit of money. And then I did a couple other things on the back of that failed miserably, fell on its face, and I learned a lot. But in saying that, I think it was very important to learn those things ahead of starting Sapien and ahead of raising the capital, because if I didn't make those mistakes in a different business, I would have made them with Sapien.
100%, 100%. So that's what I think when people want to like, start up, like you've got to take the first risk. You've got to make some mistakes because no one's going to know it the first way. Like even with a playbook or whatever you have, like it's not going to be that straightforward for you because everyone's case is like a case to case basis. Like it's not very straightforward. So I think I get where you're coming from.
There is unfortunately no playbook for being a good founder, right? You're either a good founder or you're not, or you learn how to be a good founder over time. I still don't know if I am. I think it's just a question of, can I get what I need to do done efficiently? And so far, I've been able to do that. But we'll try and figure out, the transition from founder to CEO is yet another significant step, and no one knows if I can do it or anybody else can. So you learn along the way.
100%, 100%. So, Ashwin, before we just started recording this, we were talking about the whole idea of like sapien. I mispronounced it first, and then I was like, oh, wait, this sounds like the Homo sapien sapien. Like, is that what your origin was? Like, and then we were talking about that. And then we also came up with the idea. What was the other idea that, the other hypothesis that people came up with? Like, could you just like talk about that? Because I found that very interesting.
Oh, the name behind the business.
Yeah, 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 yeah. The eye to eye.
You asked me why we'd call SAP YEN as opposed to IEN, and the real response for that was the domain was cheaper. And it's like, look, I mean, I thought of the name effectively because sitting in a corner once going, everything that we do as a company, if we do well enough, will have a profound implication on how the rest of the human population develops over time, right? Therefore, fundamentally taking it back to human as a concept. And the word also means wise in Latin. So I think is the idea of providing knowledge to a population and helping grow the human race as we progress. The company, I think, was a reason why the name appealed to me. But then the domain was a why because it was cheaper. And then everybody would come out to me eventually and say it was a pretty smart decision because of the Y chromosome and for men, and it's a male fertility business. But people love post-rationalizing things, and I've
Like you
enjoyed.
said, like in retrospect, in hindsight, a lot of things fit together.
I've really enjoyed the benefit of smart people telling me that we've made good choices when I really what wasn't deeply as capable at picking
Right.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense, makes sense. So, Ashwin, where do you see Sapien like going forward in the next few years? Like you're already operating parts of Europe and in the US, and I think Australia, you guys have almost captured the entire market. So, what is it that you guys see next? Like, are there any countries you want to enter into? What are your kind of milestones you guys are looking at this point in time?
Over the next 18 to 24 months, we'll continue to saturate the markets that we're currently operating in. There's plenty of ways, like a long way to go before we get it all right. So I think as we do that, we'll also start to recognize some very core operational difficulties and things of that sort that we need to continually work towards improving. So the next 24 months is going to be getting the operations right, saturating the market with Sapien in the markets that we currently operate in. We're in conversations with some emerging markets around the world. One of the core things to note with those markets, however, is the price of the male fertility diagnostic is a lot cheaper than what we're able to currently offer given the cost of our manufacturing. But if we're able to do it locally in those markets, we become a very strong contender for male fertility testing in those countries, particularly markets like India, for example, where the taboo around male fertility, fertility in general, is quite significant. An at-home solution, particularly one that's done in conjunction with a large IVF clinic or with the health system, would be significantly beneficial at a population level. Getting the economics right is going to be pretty important. So we'll spend the next 2 to 3 years focusing on getting the numbers right.
No, 100%, that makes sense. But when you're entering, say, a cost-conscious market or something like that, right? How do you bring down your cost? Like, is it more scale of production? Is it newer technology? Like, how do you guys at Sapien look at it?
I think it's you need to hit economies of scale pretty quickly. It's a manufacturing game, right? If we can get full volume commitments from IVF clinics, we're very aware of the fact that our margins in the US are going to be much higher than our margins in India, at least to start with. But the benefit of a market like India is the size of the population and the number of people that are interested in having a child, and the number of people that have fertility issues. So note, Asia Pac has the highest infertility rate in the world, right? So it effectively becomes a very, very strong market for us to pursue. But at the same time, worth noting that we'd only pursue the market if we feel like we could actively offer a product that was within the affordability range for the masses. Because the last thing I want to do is build an accessible product that isn't affordable, right? Because
100%,
it's takes
100%.
away from the actual accessibility of it.
Right. It's not just about science. The economics also has to make sense with it.
Yeah, I mean, look, people hate talking about numbers when it comes to healthcare because it inherently feels transactional. But
Right.
unfortunately, whether or not people like it, someone's going to buy something and someone's paying for it and someone benefits from it. And that equation remains the same regardless of which industry you operate in. I think it's just better to have those conversations outright and recognize that price is a significant factor when it comes to healthcare decisions. We have better science, but we're still more affordably priced than all of our competitors in the market. Because I don't think, for one, you can build an accessible product by separating accessibility and affordability.
100%, 100%. Two ways that always go together. Makes sense. So is there anything, Ashwin, you knew wish you had you wish you'd known earlier, like through your journey? Like it could be related to like how you were looking for investors at some point, or like maybe whatever. You know, like, was there something that you think you wish you'd known? Some if someone's watching this podcast, building something in the
Yeah.
health space, maybe applying for one regulation before the other, or like whatever.
Yeah, like there's about 10 things I wish I knew every day that I don't. But the most important thing I think I learned through the process is three things result in bad businesses: bad founders, bad money, and bad friends. And I think bad friends is the part of that equation most people don't talk about. Who you are in company with, I think it makes a huge difference to how you build the company, what type of advice you take. So I get around good people pretty early and surround yourself with people that have much more value to add to your life than you can add to theirs at the very start, and then learn how to add value to theirs.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So, I think Ashwin, one thing I'm wondering, if someone wants to is looking at like the health space, say the ART space itself, are there? And I'm huge. I'm huge on like ART. I feel like going forward with the lifestyle people in our generation are leading, and like with the food we're having, the amount of exercise we do, I think like ART is going to have like a crazy future going ahead. So, I'm huge on like cryo freezing and like things like that as well. Like, what other opportunities like do you think exist like in the ART space or like in the health domain in general that you think people are still not acting upon, and you think people can make strides in?
Something that I think people aren't necessarily paying a lot of attention to, and I think the larger private equity funds have a sense for it, but it's important to create low cost fertility treatment that doesn't take away from the actual treatment. What you do see at most IVF clinics offering low cost fertility treatments is they make it a very bare bones approach. So there's no care towards fertility. Most of the medications that are optional aren't necessarily provided to the patient. I think it's important to try and build a holistic model that's low cost. The reason why I say that, and despite my previous argument about economics, is I think the economics works out at scale for a low cost provider in IVF. Reason for that is 17% of the population is faced with infertility issues, but 1 to 1.5% of children are born through IVF, right? Now,
Mm.
assuming 50% of the people don't want to have children at all, the other 50% of people, a vast majority of them can't afford fertility treatment. It is very expensive. The margins for most IVF clinics are ridiculously low. It's important to, as an IVF clinic, acknowledge that where they make money is the service component of fertility, which is the actual procedure, and not on diagnostics. Outsource the diagnostics, remove everything from the clinic, and offer them really good care at a price point that's actually palatable. And there's a significant market yet to be captured.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, Ashwin. That makes a lot of sense. So, as we come towards the end of this like particular episode, so is this something you want to like give out to people who are like either trying to get out of whatever they're doing and like start a company, or someone who's just starting off and like trying to gain some expertise? How do you generally look at like finding product market fit or like raising funds or whatever it is? Like any advice you think you want to give out to people there?
Um, I think the only thing would be say yes more often than you say no. But and I know that that's very counterintuitive to what the typical advice is, which is oftentimes you get taught
Say
to
no
say.
more. Yeah.
But I don't know. Look, I mean, I thought I planned my life to the T when I was a lot younger, just writing down I've got a little notes app on my phone that I've carried from phone to phone. It tells you all the things I wanted to achieve up until I was about 60 years old, and I kept checking those boxes. And at a certain point, you look at it going, but this means I'm now fixed to a plan that I built when I was younger, when I didn't understand what the possibilities were, when I was very limited in my understanding of the world. So I think when people take a step back and say yes to things that they previously wouldn't have said yes to, there is a whole world of possibilities that potentially unfold. You're probably wrong about 90% of them, but there's a good chance that 1 in 10 of them turn out to be okay.
Wow. That
Also,
makes a lot of sense.
don't listen to binary advice. If someone says never do this or definitely do this, probably wrong.
Wow. Pretty. That's also, yeah. I think I can understand the counterintuitive arguments to all of those. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Ashwin, this was like a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate all the insights, and I think it's pretty cool what you're doing, and all the best for the journey ahead as well.
No, thank you very much for having me. Do you say first person to do the podcast? Is
Yes,
that
you're the first guest now.
pretty excited to jump on board? So thanks for having me on board.
Absolutely, Ashwin. Thank you so much. So thank you everyone for watching this episode. If you haven't hit the subscribe button, please do so now, and stay tuned for more episodes.